Arben, Dritan, and Ilir arrived in Liverpool with nothing but ambition and a code of loyalty that ran deeper than blood. Within months, they were invisible rulers of the city's streets, controlling drugs, money, and power, all without anyone noticing. This is the story of how three men from a small country built an empire in the shadows, where silence was their weapon and loyalty was law. Liverpool had always been a city of movement, a place where the tides of trade, culture, and crime flowed together in constant motion. The docks were its heartbeat, creaking with the weight of containers, ships, and secrets. By day, the streets bustled with workers, tourists, and locals going about their lives. By night, shadows moved differently, quieter, slower, but no less dangerous. It was in these shadows that a new force began to emerge, one that would change the city's criminal landscape forever. In the late 2000s, a group of men arrived from Eastern Europe, mostly from small towns in Albania. They came with few possessions, but carried something far more valuable: experience in surviving harsh environments and an unshakable loyalty to one another. They were not like the local gangs who fought openly for recognition and territory. These newcomers understood the power of patience, discretion, and the art of invisibility. Their presence was almost imperceptible at first. They rented apartments in nondescript buildings, worked in legitimate businesses during the day, and moved through the city without drawing attention. No flashy cars, no public displays of wealth, and certainly no unnecessary violence. They understood that control did not require fear alone. It required strategy. Their first months in Liverpool were spent observing. They studied the routines of police patrols, the habits of street-level dealers, and the vulnerabilities of existing criminal networks. Every corner of the city, from the crowded neighborhoods near the docks to the quieter residential streets, was mapped mentally. Every interaction, every conversation, every weakness in the local system was noted. This was not a group in a rush. They knew that time was an ally. Small, seemingly insignificant actions would lay the foundation for a much larger empire. Their initial operations were modest but calculated. A few packages moved through the port unnoticed. Small sums of money changed hands in hidden meetings. Messages were passed discreetly, often through people who had no idea of the larger structure they were serving. To the outside world, it looked like ordinary immigrant activity work, errands, and quiet evenings. But beneath this veneer, a network was forming, connected by trust, secrecy, and an unspoken understanding of mutual dependence. The group's strength was their discipline. Unlike many gangs in Liverpool at the time, they avoided impulsive violence that drew attention. If disputes arose, they were handled privately and decisively. Any member who displayed disloyalty or recklessness vanished from the network quietly, leaving no trace. This created a culture of fear, but also of respect. Every newcomer understood that survival depended not just on courage, but on obedience and patience. By the end of their first year, small ripples of their influence were already visible. A street-level dealer might notice that shipments were suddenly arriving more reliably, or that certain products were cheaper and easier to obtain. Local gangs began to depend on these newcomers without realizing it, forming a silent chain of power that was growing stronger by the day. What the public saw were ordinary streets, bustling markets, and quiet neighborhoods. What was unseen was a meticulously constructed empire, ready to expand when the moment was right. Liverpool, a city of movement and change, was about to become the stage for a silent, calculated takeover, and the shadows were already taking control. What set this group apart was not just their origin, but the way they operated. Loyalty was not merely expected, it was enforced, embedded in every action, and carried across borders like an unbreakable bond. Many members were bound by blood, cousins, brothers, or distant relatives who had grown up in the same villages. Others came from the same towns and shared unspoken codes learned through hardship, poverty, and a lifetime of survival in environments where betrayal could mean death. In Liverpool, these ties became the foundation of something far more powerful than any weapon or threat. New recruits were not thrown into violent tasks immediately. Instead, they were observed, tested, and evaluated. Their first assignments were simple but revealing. They might be asked to deliver a package without drawing attention, shadow a senior member to learn routines, or handle small sums of money with precision. Every action was a test of patience, discretion, and reliability. Those who failed quietly disappeared from the circle, their absence a warning to others. Those who succeeded gained small amounts of trust, which gradually increased over months and sometimes years. The organization functioned like a machine, precise and silent. Leaders rarely flaunted power. Instead, they operated in the background, making decisions that rippled outward without being noticed. Orders were carried out without question, and communication was structured to avoid mistakes. Messages moved through multiple hands, each person knowing only what they needed to know. In this way, even if one link in the chain was broken, the system remained intact. Money moved upward, but respect flowed downward. Leaders ensured that members lower in the hierarchy were taken care of, that basic needs were met, and that loyalty was rewarded with small privileges or trust in increasingly important tasks. This created a culture where obedience was motivated not by fear alone, but by a sense of belonging and shared success. Members were willing to risk everything for the group because they understood that their survival, and often their family's safety, depended on it. Rules were enforced silently but decisively. Punishments for betrayal or recklessness were swift and often permanent. Disappearances, sudden relocations, or public removals reinforced the code without creating unnecessary attention. Violence was a last resort, a tool used carefully to maintain control and silence. The very threat of retribution, combined with the deep-rooted bonds of loyalty, ensured that members rarely strayed. This code also extended beyond the city. Relationships in Albania, Kosovo, and other parts of Europe were maintained through careful communication and shared interests. The group had connections that allowed them to import goods, move money, and expand influence without exposing their activities locally. Loyalty was not just about obedience. It was about survival and expansion. Those who respected the code thrived, while those who failed were forgotten. Over time, the organization became more than a network. It became a family in the truest sense, bound by blood, discipline, and an unspoken understanding of power. The streets of Liverpool may have seemed chaotic and lawless to outsiders, but inside this circle, order reigned. Every decision, every action, every quiet movement was part of a larger plan. The Albanian network was not merely a gang, it was a carefully structured empire built on loyalty, patience, and the unyielding principle that betrayal was never tolerated. In this environment, power was not taken by force alone. It was earned through obedience, tested through patience, and solidified through trust that ran deeper than blood itself. Liverpool's drug market was chaotic, a web of small-time dealers, rival gangs, and unpredictable supply chains. Streets were divided into territories. Corners belonged to different crews, and loyalty was often temporary. Violence was common, and law enforcement struggled to keep up with the constant turnover of arrests and turf wars. The market was crowded, noisy, and inefficient, exactly the opportunity the Albanian network had been waiting for. They didn't rush into public fights or street battles. Instead, they focused on what truly mattered: control of the supply. The group's strategy was simple but effective. While local gangs scrambled over who sold where, the Albanians secured direct connections to producers overseas. Large shipments of drugs moved through the port quietly, concealed inside legal cargo, disguised under layers of paperwork and legitimate trade. They bypassed middlemen whenever possible, lowering costs and increasing reliability. This allowed them to offer products at prices local gangs could not match, creating a subtle dependency. Dealers who once controlled streets found themselves reliant on a supplier they could neither see nor confront. Their approach was patient and calculated. They didn't aim to take over territory immediately. They infiltrated it. They supplied the most profitable areas first, making sure demand was met without drawing attention. Small mistakes by competitors, like a delayed shipment or overpricing, became opportunities. Slowly, the Albanians became the unseen backbone of Liverpool's drug market. Those who resisted were cut off quietly, without public confrontations that might attract police or media attention. Street-level dealers and small gangs began noticing changes. Some were grateful for the dependable supply, unaware that it came with strings attached. Others began to feel uneasy, sensing that their power was diminishing. Yet no one could clearly trace the flow of control. It was invisible. The network's influence spread not through intimidation alone, but through efficiency, consistency, and the illusion of choice. Dealers who refused the new suppliers risked shortages and losses, forcing them to comply. The organization's reach extended beyond just drugs. They controlled the logistics, transportation, and even financial aspects of the trade. Couriers were carefully vetted, deliveries were tracked discreetly, and money flowed through layered systems designed to avoid detection. This made it nearly impossible for authorities to uncover the full scope of operations. Competitors were left frustrated, unable to pinpoint who was truly in charge. The Albanians had created a market within a market, one that operated quietly and efficiently under the radar. As supply dominance grew, the group's power in Liverpool became undeniable. Local gangs still controlled small territories and could enforce order on their corners, but they were no longer independent. The Albanians had introduced a new hierarchy, one based not on violence alone, but on control of essential resources. This quiet dominance reshaped the city's underworld, creating a network that could survive setbacks, avoid exposure, and expand further. By the time the larger criminal world realized what was happening, the network was already entrenched. Liverpool's drug trade was no longer a chaotic battleground. It was a carefully managed operation, with the Albanians pulling strings from behind the scenes. Their rise was invisible, yet absolute. Control was no longer measured in street fights or public displays of power. It was measured in supply, influence, and the silent obedience of those who had no choice but to follow. In this quiet war, patience and strategy proved far deadlier than bullets. As the Albanian network solidified its control over Liverpool's drug supply, the next step was to transform money into power while remaining invisible. Cash alone could only take them so far. Openly stashing millions in warehouses or moving it through untraceable couriers was risky. Law enforcement had grown alert to patterns of large cash movements, and any slip could expose the entire organization. The solution was to create layers of legitimacy, businesses that served as both cover and cash laundries. These ventures were ordinary on the surface: car washes, small construction companies, cafes, and rental properties. To anyone walking past, they looked like hard-working, law-abiding establishments run by immigrants trying to make a new life. But beneath the facade, every transaction was calculated, every payment recorded with precision, and every employee carefully vetted. Money earned from illegal activities would flow into these businesses, be cleaned, and then redistributed to fund new operations, bribe officials if necessary, and expand influence further. The ordinary became extraordinary in its purpose. The leaders of the network avoided ostentation. Unlike stereotypical gangsters flaunting luxury cars or mansions, they lived modestly. Their public personas were unremarkable, blending seamlessly into Liverpool's neighborhoods. This invisibility was strategic. It allowed them to operate without attracting attention from police, journalists, or rival gangs. Those on the streets saw only ordinary people running everyday businesses, never suspecting that the quiet cafe on the corner was funding a vast criminal network, or that the construction site employing locals was a front for laundering millions. The organization's expansion was methodical. Each new business served multiple purposes. Beyond laundering money, they acted as logistical hubs, recruitment points, and safe houses. Couriers could pass through these locations unnoticed. Meetings could be held behind closed doors, and financial records could be adjusted to match their true income. By diversifying the portfolio of businesses, the network ensured that even if one venture drew scrutiny, the larger empire remained insulated. The web was complex and interconnected, yet deliberately compartmentalized so that no single arrest or seizure could unravel it entirely. The network's influence extended beyond the financial sphere. By embedding themselves into legitimate business sectors, they gained subtle leverage over local communities. Employees depended on their jobs, suppliers relied on their contracts, and neighbors saw them as contributors rather than threats. This dual existence criminal empire, hidden behind lawful operations, made it nearly impossible for outsiders to understand the true scale of their power. Liverpool's streets appeared calm, productive, and ordinary, while beneath the surface, the Albanian network controlled supply chains, money flows, and the loyalties of thousands. Their ability to remain hidden while expanding was the key to their dominance. By avoiding public violence and focusing on control rather than confrontation, they minimized the risks of law enforcement interference. Every move was calculated, every business carefully selected for strategic advantage, and every decision measured against the potential for exposure. The result was an empire that was both visible and invisible at the same time. A network that touched nearly every corner of the city, yet left little evidence for authorities to act upon. By the time local gangs and police realized the extent of the Albanian influence, it was already deeply entrenched. The organization's control was not just about drugs or money, it was about perception. To the world outside, Liverpool remained a city of commerce and community. To those within the network, it was a chessboard, each piece carefully positioned, each move calculated, and every shadow holding power that few could see, but everyone depended upon. The quiet, disciplined, and invisible approach ensured that the Albanian Mafia had become more than a criminal network. It had become a hidden backbone of the city itself. Even the most carefully constructed empires are not immune to cracks, and by the time the Albanian network had fully entrenched itself in Liverpool, small fractures began to appear. The organization had grown rapidly, and with growth came complexity, mistakes, and exposure. What had once been a tightly controlled, disciplined group now faced the pressures of scale. One shipment arrived late, a courier was arrested. A financial trail was traced too clearly, all minor incidents in isolation, but enough to send ripples through a network that relied on precision and secrecy. Internal tensions became more apparent as younger members began to push boundaries. Many of them had grown up in the city or spent their formative years within the organization and were eager for recognition and faster money. They were less willing to wait patiently for loyalty and discretion to pay off. Some flaunted wealth on social media, posting expensive cars, jewelry, and vacations. What they saw as status symbols were, to the organization, dangerous attention. The old guard, those who had survived by patience and invisibility, grew increasingly concerned. Their methods had always been quiet, methodical, and calculated. Public displays of wealth or carelessness threatened to undo years of careful work. Rival gangs also noticed the emerging power structure and attempted to exploit any perceived weakness. Small skirmishes and minor confrontations tested the organization's ability to maintain control without revealing itself. Though the Albanian network avoided large-scale street violence, strategic interventions were necessary. Couriers were redirected, supply routes changed overnight, and key operations temporarily paused to minimize exposure. These adjustments were silent, invisible to the public eye, but they required coordination and trust. Even minor lapses could ripple outward, creating opportunities for both police and competitors. The network also faced the psychological strain of secrecy. Members were constantly aware that any mistake could have severe consequences. Trust, once the most valuable asset, became fragile. Suspicion spread quietly among the ranks. Loyalty was still revered, but it was constantly tested. Members learned to guard their words, their actions, and even their thoughts. Any hint of betrayal, carelessness, or ambition could trigger disciplinary measures, sometimes permanent. The rules that had once been simple and absolute became more complicated, as leaders had to balance maintaining control with keeping the organization functional. Despite these cracks, the empire remained resilient. Failures were contained, and the leadership adapted quickly. Vulnerable members were removed or reassigned, routes were recalculated, and operational protocols were reinforced. The Albanian network had grown used to operating under pressure, and these challenges, while significant, were not enough to dismantle it. Instead, they acted as tests, strengthening the organization's ability to respond to threats and adapt to changing circumstances. What became clear during this period was that the greatest dangers to the network did not come from outside forces alone. While law enforcement and rival gangs posed risks, internal instability was far more threatening. Ambition, impatience, and carelessness had the potential to unravel years of careful planning. The silent war within the organization was as intense and consequential as any street battle, and it demonstrated that the Albanian Mafia's control over Liverpool depended not only on supply and money, but on discipline, obedience, and the constant management of human nature. In the end, these early cracks were a reminder that no empire is invincible. Even the most disciplined, patient, and well-hidden network must contend with the unpredictable elements of growth, ambition, and human error. For the Albanian Mafia, the challenge was to correct these weaknesses before they became public vulnerabilities, a test of resilience that would define the next stage of their control over the city. As the Albanian network expanded, law enforcement attention intensified, but arrests remained frustratingly rare. Multiple investigations were launched, raids conducted, and surveillance operations carried out, yet tangible results were elusive. Witnesses refused to speak, intimidated by fear or loyalty. Evidence often disappeared or was too circumstantial to hold up in court. On the surface, it appeared as if the organization was untouchable, a ghostly presence operating just beyond the reach of the law. Yet behind the scenes, a different kind of war was unfolding, one that was invisible, strategic, and far more dangerous than any street-level conflict. The internal dynamics of the network had shifted. Leaders knew that external pressures from police and rival gangs were inevitable, so they turned their focus inward to maintain control. The silent war within the organization was ruthless. Members who showed weakness, disloyalty, or even carelessness were dealt with decisively. Disappearances, relocations, and reassignment of roles occurred quietly, leaving little trace. Fear and discipline were combined to reinforce loyalty. Everyone understood that their survival depended not only on obedience, but on maintaining the delicate balance of secrecy and efficiency. Operational adjustments became constant. Supply routes were changed overnight. Safe houses and businesses used for money laundering or meetings were rotated or closed entirely. Couriers were reassigned, and contingency plans were enacted for every conceivable scenario. The network's ability to adapt quickly was its greatest strength. While the city outside seemed calm, a highly organized system of checks, balances, and strategic maneuvers kept the organization insulated from disruption. Every member was a piece in a larger chessboard, their movements carefully monitored to maintain the illusion of invisibility. At the same time, rival gangs attempted to exploit perceived weaknesses. Small disputes and minor confrontations were engineered, testing both the loyalty of members and the organization's capacity to respond without exposing itself. The Albanian network had learned to absorb these challenges silently, resolving issues internally and without public spectacle. Violence was reserved for situations where it could be contained or used strategically. To outsiders, the city remained orderly, while the underworld moved like a carefully controlled clockwork machine. The psychological pressure on members was intense. Everyone knew that a single mistake could have dire consequences, and the stress of constant surveillance, both from authorities and internal leadership, created an atmosphere of tension. Suspicion became a survival tool. Trust was extended cautiously, often only after repeated tests of obedience and discretion. Even long-serving members were aware that their position was never guaranteed. This culture of vigilance, while harsh, ensured the organization's resilience. Despite these challenges, the network continued to thrive. The ability to manage both external and internal pressures allowed it to remain in control of Liverpool's drug trade, finances, and influence over local communities. What appeared as calm streets and ordinary neighborhoods masked a complex web of operations that adapted quickly to any threat. The Albanian network's strength lay not in brute force, but in precision, secrecy, and an unwavering commitment to discipline. By the end of this period, it was clear that the Albanian Mafia's control was not simply a matter of money or drugs. It was a sophisticated system of management, secrecy, and strategy. Their power was reinforced by silence, fear, and loyalty, and it moved through the city unseen. While police and rival gangs believed they were pressing hard, the organization was already several steps ahead, orchestrating a silent war that ensured their continued dominance over Liverpool's criminal underworld. After years of meticulous planning and silent dominance, law enforcement finally appeared to have found a breakthrough. Intelligence operations, surveillance, and undercover investigations culminated in a coordinated series of raids across Liverpool. Multiple properties linked to the Albanian network were stormed, millions in cash and assets were seized, and several key figures were taken into custody. Media outlets quickly declared it a major victory, framing it as the collapse of the Albanian Mafia's grip on the city. Headlines portrayed the arrests as the end of an era, celebrating what seemed like the dismantling of a powerful criminal empire. To the public, it looked like justice had finally prevailed. The streets of Liverpool, quiet for years under the network's silent rule, appeared to breathe easier. Dealers were questioned, businesses scrutinized, and law enforcement claimed a hard-won victory. Yet beneath the surface, the truth was far more complicated. Those arrested were not the true masterminds. They were buffers, strategically placed to absorb attention and shield the leadership from exposure. Their arrest was anticipated, even planned for, as part of a larger operational strategy. The empire's core, the silent architects behind the operations, remained untouched, observing the events with careful calculation. The network's resilience was evident in the immediate aftermath. Within weeks, shipments resumed, financial flows were restored, and businesses were reopened under new names. Supply chains that had been temporarily disrupted quickly adapted to new routes and personnel. The organization had contingency plans for such scenarios, designed to withstand raids, arrests, and public scrutiny. Law enforcement had removed visible players, but the real power, hidden in plain sight, continued to operate. This ability to recover so quickly demonstrated that the network's strength was not tied to individual members, but to its structure, discipline, and the loyalty that held it together. The arrests also revealed the sophistication of the Albanian approach to risk management. Every high-ranking figure had a buffer, every operation a backup plan, and every business a contingency to continue functioning under pressure. The strategy was clear: sacrifice the expendable to protect the essential. In doing so, the network ensured continuity, minimizing disruption to operations and maintaining influence over local gangs, dealers, and communities. This was not mere survival, it was strategic adaptation, turning what seemed like defeat into an opportunity to reinforce control. The public perception of a fall was a carefully constructed illusion. It satisfied authorities, distracted the media, and gave rival groups the false impression that a power vacuum had emerged. In reality, the organization's operations were uninterrupted at the core, and its leadership remained securely in command. The arrests became a tool, a demonstration of the network's foresight and ability to manipulate both external forces and public perception. By the end of this period, it became clear that the Albanian Mafia's presence in Liverpool could not be measured by arrests, headlines, or visible power alone. Their control was silent, invisible, and deeply entrenched. The empire had weathered a storm designed to destroy it, yet it emerged not weakened, but refined, its structures tested and strengthened. What looked like collapse to outsiders was, in fact, a calculated retreat, a tactical maneuver that ensured the organization's dominance would continue. Liverpool's streets remained under the silent authority of the network, a city that appeared calm while its true rulers operated from the shadows, fully aware that power was not about survival alone, but about resilience, foresight, and the unbreakable bonds of loyalty that held the empire together. Years passed, and the debate about the Albanian Mafia's presence in Liverpool never truly ended. Some believed the arrests and asset seizures had destroyed the organization for good. Others sensed that something still lingered beneath the surface, unseen but active. The truth was quieter and more unsettling. The network had not vanished. It had evolved. What remained was not a loud criminal force, but a system refined by pressure, mistakes, and survival. Power no longer needed to announce itself. It existed in patterns, influence, and silence. The streets of Liverpool looked unchanged. Cafes opened each morning, construction projects continued, and ships arrived at the docks as they always had. Life moved forward, ordinary and predictable. Yet beneath this normality, control persisted in subtle ways. Supply chains operated smoothly, financial routes remained hidden, and decisions were made far from public view. The organization no longer relied on constant expansion. It focused on stability, ensuring that what it controlled stayed controlled. This restraint made it harder to detect and even harder to challenge. Leadership became more distant, more protected. Those at the top reduced direct involvement, communicating through layers designed to prevent exposure. Younger members were either absorbed into the discipline of the old code or quietly removed. There was no room left for recklessness. The lessons learned from near collapse had reshaped the network's mindset. Survival was now valued above ambition, and invisibility above dominance. The goal was no longer to rule openly, but to exist permanently. Law enforcement continued to monitor suspected links, but cases struggled to gain traction. Without witnesses, without visible leaders, and without clear evidence, investigations stalled. The network's greatest defense was not corruption or violence, but patience. Time weakened interest, shifted priorities, and dulled urgency. While attention moved elsewhere, the organization maintained its position, confident that silence was its strongest shield. Local criminal groups understood the reality better than anyone. Even without visible enforcement, boundaries were respected. Supplies arrived as expected. Debts were settled without public conflict. The absence of chaos was itself a sign of control. No one needed to be reminded who held influence. It was understood, quietly and completely. Fear no longer came from violence, but from certainty. The legacy of the Albanian Mafia in Liverpool was not written in headlines or court records. It was written in systems that continued to function without disruption. It was written in the way markets stabilized, conflicts disappeared before they escalated, and power shifted without noise. This was not an empire built to impress, but one designed to last. In the end, the greatest twist was not a dramatic downfall or a violent conclusion. It was the realization that true power does not seek attention. It adapts, hides, and waits. Liverpool remained a city of movement, just as it had always been. Ships continued to arrive, people continued to come and go, and life carried on above ground. But in the shadows, where loyalty mattered more than words and patience mattered more than force, power endured. The story did not end with blood or betrayal. It ended with silence and the understanding that some empires survive not by conquering openly, but by mastering the art of remaining unseen.